Now, transitioning to Reagan. Reagan represents in many ways the tip of a spear. Okay, he's on the front of a wave, and the wave he's on the front of is a wave of this conservative resurgence. What you wind up seeing is that you've got numerous groups in American society that Richard Nixon labeled as the silent majority, the hard hats that George Wallace had been appealing to, blue-collar, middle-class Americans, and white-collar Americans as well, were starting to shift away to react against the 1960s. In many ways, this movement is rejectionist of the 1960s Great Society philosophy, which means big government as well, but it's against things like welfare, things like gay rights, things like affirmative action, things like all the big government New Deal programs we had seen during this time, the change in sexual morals that we'd seen with reproductive technologies. It's against abortion, against drug abuse, against the rock and roll culture of this 60s, 70s era that we see, that Americans thought were kind of tearing away at what the country was supposed to really be all about. And so this new right is led by anti-tax forces, but also pro-evangelical forces. A pendulum is swinging again, and this pendulum of the moral majority of Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, people of this religious stripe, argued that we needed to fundamentally return the United States to Judeo-Christian principles in terms of governance, policy, as well as the way that we live our daily lives. And one of the major galvanizing spurs in this was the Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortion, which got these groups to say we need to be more politically active. Additionally, the notion of reverse discrimination shows up in terms of maybe affirmative action programs might give preferential treatment to minorities to get them into positions, but there's a cost in terms of then the other white majority person of the population who would be denied that position as a result. So many Republicans are going to be elected into Congress on Reagan's coattails, if you will. He brings in many people with him during this time. And his policies will go under the nickname of Reaganomics. And what Reaganomics is, it's an economic plan that involves tax cuts, budget cuts, and increased defense spending. The idea behind this is the so-called supply side theory, which we even see in the 1920s, was that if you cut taxes, reduce taxes on corporations and the wealthiest Americans, and that will spur corporations to greater productivity, and it will spur the wealthiest Americans to use more of that money versus taxes. They'll use it in the economy, which will trickle down throughout the other aspects of the economy, and you'll actually generate more tax revenue. The more you cut taxes, you'll get more productivity, more profits, which are taxed at whatever rate they're taxed at, will generate you more revenue that you'll get coming in. As the economy grows, the tax rates will grow with it. This is it's the so-called Laffer curve or Laffer argument that tax rates, by reducing them, tax rates will actually at a certain point go up in total accumulations of taxes. Affirmative action pushback in the Bakke decision, Bakke versus California Board of Regents, the High Court argued in 1978 rather, that an affirmative action quota policy system allowing for specific slots for individuals of minority or color would be unconstitutional, and you have to end preferential treatments based just on racial or ethnic backgrounds alone. So this began the rallying cry for this pushback against affirmative action, which was known as reverse discrimination. With supply side theory, in the 1980s, you're going to see economic prosperity for a certain class of Americans. For the wealthier upper tiers and corporate tiers and big corporate America, you'll see an increase in prosperity through the 80s. For working class Americans and union labor and the poor, you're going to see a stagnation or even a decline in real wages over time. And coupled with this are going to be huge budget deficits from the 80s, which are still with us to the present day. Part of the reason they're with us is because of Ronald Reagan's defense buildup. Ronald Reagan actively pursued a program that was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. And the logic behind his program was to try to essentially set up a anti-ballistic missile satellite technology system in outer space to destroy incoming Russian missiles as sort of like an umbrella or a shield. This is largely, at the time that he was discussing it, a fictional fantasy that the technology didn't exist for, but we were going to put money into it. The more compelling thing is that Soviets thought we could do it, or were worried we would, and it pushed them to try to accelerate their defense spending as well to keep up, along with other conventional spending we were making, which accelerated the teetering of the Soviet economy into its ultimate collapse. So the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, while on its own is this high-tech military defense system never being fully developed, it had the effect of compelling Russians to spend defensive money to keep up with us, or realize that they could not necessarily sustain that and not stay in that game. During this entire time, we're seeing major transitions and shifts in the American economy. The old economic Rust Belt model of industrial production the American economy has been based on, that is shifting. And it's shifting away from organized labor, shifting away from big union jobs, shifting away from lifetime legacy employment, and it's shifting to a new model of far more worker uncertainty, and it's creating a new class of winners and losers. Those with education, those with access, those with the incomes were tending to rise through the 80s. Those without that were stagnating or maybe declining in many ways, those at the margins. Social service reductions coupled with this, reductions in welfare, reductions in programs like food stamps, reductions in programs such as your educational programs or Head Start programs or programs for rural areas and poverty. Those reductions were sort of reallocating the American economic pie in ways that there becomes this new forgotten class. The emergence of the homeless as an American phenomenon that we're sort of quite familiar with today, as we see it today in its current context, comes out of and has grown on these policies that we've seen from the 1980s forward. Also with deregulation in the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion, you had ranchers and developers in the West who demanded an opening up of federal wilderness land to logging, to mineral exploitation, coastal waters for developers, for petroleum extraction developing, and many Republicans out of the West pushed for these programs to try to advance the economic agenda of the free market capitalist model, but also to get the government out of some of these stewardship or managerial aspirations or angles or professions. Ronald Reagan famously said, his most enduring quote on his philosophy is, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." And so the deregulation that comes in corporate America during this time, minimizing federal oversight, minimizing federal standards and regulations from whether they're environmental or workplace safety or developmental standards, corporate standards, etc., that starts to be done as a major step to try to engage and stimulate the economy. He's able to do this, but at the same time, the massive defense expenditures that Reagan puts out imbalances the economy to the extent that imbalances the government's spending to the extent that we've never really recovered from since. In terms of foreign policy, Reagan said for America, it was morning in America again. And for his foreign policy, he believed in a muscular foreign policy that involved negotiating with the Soviets from a position of strength. And to do this, he sort of is in that Nixon sense, he sort of is one of the old school, coldest of the cold warriors. We will build up enough strength and then compel the Soviets to either match us or have to essentially admit their inability to match us in this global game. So he wants to extend American influence and project it again, which called for major defense budgets. For instance, in Nicaragua underwent a revolution where you had these families in Nicaragua, the old families in Nicaragua that we had supported were overthrown by leftist Daniel Ortega and a group known as the Sandinistas. The Reagan administration was afraid of the domino theory taking place in Central America in the expansion of communism. So as a result, Reagan and his foreign policy team supported a group called the Contras, those that were against the Sandinista regime, a guerrilla group that was based in El Salvador and that opposed the Sandinistas. Now to support them, this is difficult because at the same time we're engaging in policy in the Middle East, which is why you've got a couple different things going on here with the Iran-Contra scandal and the Lebanon invasion. Terrorist groups loyal to Iran, I have to shift gears for just a second. Terrorist groups loyal to Iran, they took many Americans hostage during this time in the early 1980s. Iran was simultaneously in the middle of an 8-year war with Iraq. President Reagan urged the U.S. not to sell arms to Iran and then to actively try to work to undercut the Iranians. But to do this, while he's doing this, in Latin America, he's busy trying to work against the communists that we see in Latin America. The anti-communists that he's supporting, the Contras, are fighting against the Sandinista government. The Reagan administration was sending aid to the Contras without congressional approval. And because of the War Powers Act thing, because of suspicions of Congress that has toward the executive going back to Vietnam, Congress passed a law banning aid to the Contras for 2 years. So the solution of the Reagan administration to this problem was to surreptitiously, to off the books, still get aid to the Contras. The way they did it was they sold arms to the Iranians, who were desperate for arms in their fight with Iraq, this 8-year war they had with Iraq. They sold arms to the Iranians in exchange for a promise to both release American hostages or have their terrorist groups in Lebanon release our hostages. And the proceeds from these arms sales, the money that we got from selling these arms to Iran, was then funneled, without Congress knowing it, into these Contra groups in Central America, in Nicaragua, breaking congressional law. Ultimately, this results in an enormous scandal that provokes congressional hearings, the Iran-Contra hearings. And in these hearings, 11 Reagan administration officials, department officials, were found guilty after a congressional investigation. No evidence was found that Reagan was involved, but by 1987, this does to a certain extent limit or cripple his abilities in terms of his credibility on Central America and foreign policy. However, in dealing with the Soviets, Reagan does, in many ways, get an awful lot of credit for ending the Cold War, although most historians argue he was simply the guy on the spot when the Cold War ended. It was a continuation of a whole series of policies that led to its end on his watch. But with his re-election in 1984, he begins to deal with the Soviet Union similar to how Nixon dealt with China. As a strong, muscular presence, he also extends the hand and says, let's engage in a dialogue with the new Soviet premier, an individual by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev had two policies, a policy of glasnost, or openness, which was about boosting individual rights such as freedom of the press, and it's going to lead to better relations with the U.S., and perestroika, which was the restructuring of Soviet society. It's going to call for less government control in Russia of the economy, a more democratic government, maybe some free elections, and even less military spending. Reagan famously looks at Gorbachev and says, this is a man that we can do business with. And as such, he negotiates with Gorbachev, like Nixon did in some ways, disarmament treaties, such as the INF Treaty. It's the first treaty between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that's actually going to reduce the number of nuclear arms each side had. Earlier treaties had put freezes, limitations on new production. This is going to actually reduce the amount of arms in both stockpiles. So it's actual movement towards a safer planet. And in the process of this, Gorbachev's policies of trying to open up the Soviet Union and trying to reform the Soviet Union at the same time lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the monumental changes that take place, it's almost like what you saw in France under Louis XV, Louis XVI. The moment a totalitarian regime tries to reform itself from the inside, they generally fail at that, because once you take the lid off, you can't reform a little. You wind up having to reform it all, and it all comes out. And ultimately, the Soviet-controlled satellite states in Eastern Europe, they break away. The Iron Curtain comes down. They break away. In 1989, the Berlin Wall is going to come down after 28 years, and the two Germanys get united as one nation. And in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapses due to internal strife. Non-Russian republics inside the big empire had brought about democratic reform, and there's economic chaos. Gorbachev resigns. Boris Yeltsin will be elected the president of the new state of Russia, which is the state you know today. And in so doing, the Cold War ends. So it's the end of this 50-year era that started with some of your lessons a little bit ago, where you've got this bipolar world of us versus them, East versus West. That world comes to a conclusion. But with its conclusion, there's a legacy that we paid. It was not free necessarily. The massive budget expenditures, the massive deficits, and this enormous military-industrial complex came along for the ride, or were the necessary byproduct of this. And in this new world, the post-Cold War world, there's going to be some real searching to find a new narrative in this, what H.W. Bush is going to call this New World Order. There's going to be a kind of redefining and redirection of America. And it's also going to lead to some revisiting of social policies from the Reagan era. As the economy boomed, it had winners, certainly had losers. And we'll see those losers, in many ways, manifest themselves in the ways that they'll vote after the Reagan era concludes. That's going to be linkage in some ways to Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. We'll try to make some of those links in our next lesson, as we'll tie Ronald Reagan to George H.W. Bush and look for a few parallels.